Our next guest recently spoke with Eric Levitz from New York Magazine about Democratic prospects for the 2022 midterms, as well as the long-term impact former President Trump had on the GOP and the electorate as a whole, saying Trump, quote, is personally responsible for a significant portion of America's education polarization.
Head of Data Science at Open Labs, David Shor, joins us now to discuss. Great to have you, David. Welcome.
Good to see you, David.
Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.
One of the things that interview really opened my eyes up to is just how bad historically midterms have been from the party in power, because you basically say, look, if Democrats match the best performance of a party in power over the past number of decades, they will barely hang on. And if they match the second best, then they're totally hosed. Can you just lay out some of those historical markers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So going back over the past 30 to 40 years of midterm environments, on average, the party that controls the presidency gets about 47.5% of the vote. If you go back and look at the last 30 years, the single best example is 2002, where we got 52.3% of the vote. But the second best example is 1998, where Democrats got 49.5. I think there's really two stories here. You know, the first is that generally, the party that controls the presidency loses seats, and that's been true, I think, something like 25 out of the 28 elections in the last 100 years. But the second piece, which I think is even more important, is that the maps are pretty biased against us. You know, the median House seat, because of all of the gerrymandering done in Republican state legislatures, is about 3 points more conservative than the country overall. You know, luckily, we have a lot of incumbents, but that means that in order for us to win, 50% or 50.5% isn't enough. We need to get something like 51.5 or even 52 in order to have a chance of winning with our current maps.
Got it. David, I was recently listening to something you were doing on Clubhouse. You talked about how materialist politics may not be the best way. I was really fascinated by that because from my perspective, I thought, you know, if there's ever going to be a time, it might be this one. You cut a $1,400 check, mass vaccinations, country, you know, GDP is going to roar. So is that scenario just too materialist in your view? In other words, is the culture war still just so strong that Democrats could be screwed in the midterm elections?
Well, I like to say that I wish that materialist politics worked, and I think that it's the Democrats' best hope. In that, in order for us to win elections, only 20% of the country identifies as liberal, and so in order for us to win, the more that politics is a question of issues about healthcare, about concrete plans the Democrats run on, the better we do, and the more it's about values, the worse we do. I think going into this midterm, we have a pretty uphill. I say we, I mean Democrats have a very uphill battle. But I do think that what Democrats are doing right now, like all of this, I guess to go back to what Crystal Ball said, we really need the single best midterm environment in order for us to hold the House. Mm-hmm. And I think that all signs point toward that being possible. I'm not saying, oh, we're totally doomed. Like you said, there's checks, there's vaccines, there's this growth. I think that Joe Biden is picking really popular things to run on and has shown a lot of messaging and ideological discipline. But it's a really uphill climb. Almost every president who's been in this situation has lost.
We watched CPAC with a lot of interest, and Joe Biden wasn't really talked about much. There was a lot of stop the steal. There was a lot of culture. Of course, famously now, Republicans have been very interested in Dr. Seuss and the quote-unquote banning of his books. Do you think that strategy of going all in on these sort of like token cultural issues actually makes sense for the GOP?
Well, I like to say that, the trick to winning elections is talking about popular things that people care about in language that people understand. And, I have to admit, I haven't done any research on this specific topic, though maybe I should. I get asked it a lot. But I think that I'm personally really skeptical that people care about cancel culture or Dr. Seuss books. And I think if you look at what Donald Trump's success was, I think people like to think of Donald Trump as, someone who rose to fame by tricking the media. But I think a really underrated point is that he really, if you listen to his speeches, if you listen to his ads, he actually did really talk about a lot of material issues that people cared about. He talked about jobs, he talked about immigration, he talked about trade. And I think that really is much closer to impacting people's lives than, some of this stuff around books, which I think is kind of too intellectual in a lot of ways to really break through to, working class voters.
It's interesting, though, David, because from my perspective, Trump did talk. I mean, his 2020 campaign was culture. And I read through your interview with Eric Levitz. You were talking about how defund the police is basically what swung, I think, 1 out of 10 Clinton Hispanic voters, Latino voters in particular, over to Trump. So are you saying that Dr. Seuss is just disaggregated from defund the police, or was defund the police just so culturally salient as a result of riots and everything was in the media? Like, if you're a Republican and you want to effectively, do what Trump did, is Dr. Seuss just not even close to the same vein? I'm trying to understand it from their perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I personally don't want to give Republicans too much advice. But what I would say is that. But what I would say is that defund the police is like a very visceral thing. Obviously, culture is. I agree that culture war is how Republicans win elections. But you really need to there are these big gaps in fundamental values and fundamental vision in society between liberals and conservatives, between highly educated people and working class white people, and you want to tap into that resentment and into that vein. I think that there's something really visceral about the police, like not showing up to your, and answering a 911 call. I think people really care about crime. I think people really care about immigration. They care about jobs. And I think it's something that liberals don't get because, we value different things. We care a lot about fairness and equality and procedural justice. And, and conservatives care a lot about, order and safety. And these are all super legitimate things to care about, but you have to tap into people where they are. I think people really want to be safe in a way that is really different than an overwhelming desire to read banned Dr. Seuss books.
Yeah. So you have
this
weird dichotomy with Trump, where on the one hand, he drove massive turnout. He helped force more of this education realignment that you also talk about in this interview. On the other hand, Republicans under him lost the House, the Senate, and the presidency. So do you think that Donald Trump has been good for the Republican Party or bad for the Republican Party, or does it depend?
Well, I just want to center this around, two sets of numbers. So in 2012, Barack Obama got about 52% of the two-party vote, and Hillary Clinton got about 51.1% of the two-party vote. And in any other country, that would have been enough for Democrats to hold power. But what happened was that the bias of the Electoral College, because Donald Trump brought in all of these working class white voters and shed all of these college-educated voters who disproportionately lived in cities on the coast, the bias of the Electoral College changed from being about 1 point biased in favor of Democrats to being about 3 points biased against Democrats. And so Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama could have won with 49.5% of the vote. And Hillary Clinton needed 51.6, and she got 51.1, and so then she lost. Flash forwarding to 2018, this big realignment that happened on education lines, it didn't just increase the bias of the Electoral College, it also massively increased the bias of the Senate. And that's why in 2018, Democrats got 54% of the vote and still lost 2 Senate seats. And so that kind of gets, and then in 2020, Democrats got about 52.3% of the vote. They narrowly eked out, the narrowest Senate majority in overtime. And the bias of the Electoral College grew. They got about 52.3% of the vote, and they needed 52% of the vote to win. If Joe Biden had gotten the same amount as Barack Obama in 2012, 52%, Donald Trump would be president today. And that's really bad. So I think that cuts to both sides of Trump. On one hand, Trump is super unpopular. He's very unlikable. A lot of swing voters don't like him for a lot of idiosyncratic reasons. But the flip side is that he has pretty massively increased the biases of America's electoral institutions, so that Republicans don't need 50% to win anymore. And I think that in the long run, if the Republicans can stay in a position where they can hold power and win trifectas with 48 or 49% of the vote, that's a very strong position for them, even if most of the country doesn't like them.
How much would H.R. 1 shift that?
I think the most important part of H.R. 1, I think people talk about automatic voter registration and voter rolls and all of that stuff. And I think that all of that's good, but I think the effects are a lot more muted than a lot of people want to admit. But the independent redistricting provisions in H.R. 1, or that H.R. 1 is trying to accomplish, are very important. And the reason for that is that because if we do not change any federal laws around redistricting, we will almost certainly lose the House. Because we need something like 52 to 52.5% in the House in order to keep our majority with our current lines, and that's almost never happened. I think if we literally replicate the 2002 midterm environments, we would have something like a 50-50 chance of holding the House under our current lines. And so that means that banning partisan redistricting, getting to some kind of proportionality standard is just incredibly important. I think that the current H.R. 1 as is, I think some people have concerns with some of the language around redistricting, but I know a lot of people are trying to fix that. But this is the most important part of the bill. I think that if we can actually do something to get rid of the Republican bias in the House, which legislatively should be possible, it would roughly triple Democratic chances of holding the House in 2022, which is a lot.
Really interesting, David.
Very significant.
Love reading your work. I encourage everybody to follow you on Twitter. Anytime you see your name in a headline, etc., to click on it. Really insightful. Thanks, man.
Great to have you, David. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
See you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.